Welcome to Your Strata Property, the podcast for property owners looking for reliable, accurate, and bite-sized information from an experienced and authoritative source.
Hello and welcome. I'm Amanda Farmer and I have with me today Rena Van Elst from Strata Central. Welcome, Rena.
Hi, Amanda. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. Busy in Strata as always. We are here, as we like to do, to chat about our wins and challenges from recent weeks. Hit me up with your challenge this week, Rena.
Well, this is again, I keep saying to everyone on our podcast a matter in relation to things that have never happened before, but this is the first as well. And sometimes it's hard to imagine in Strata there'll be a first when you've been doing it for as long as you and I have been. But we had this particular owner in a building that we took over, I think, last year, where when we attended initially to do the walk around, he had actually installed a pipe. He was on level 1 in the building, the balcony on level 1. He installed a pipe running all the way down the side of the balcony, all the way underneath, and then traversing across, then down onto the facade of the building and attaching to a common property tap. So he's using the tap to water his plants and bits and pieces. Anyway, so committee have been concerned. This person used to be a building manager as well for the building, and then now they've got a separate independent building manager, not an owner. So we sent him a couple of breach letters. Of course, he didn't, respond. He basically refused to answer and didn't remove the piping and his access to the tap. So the new building manager arranged for a new tap to be put on that had a lock thing on it so that you couldn't actually use it anymore, because obviously with someone like that, the committee thought it would be better just to try and stop his access as opposed to taking any further action.
Got it.
Anyway, so then what this particular person did was, and then he's been filmed because obviously there's cameras everywhere, he got a power tool and he actually cut that lock. And the committee have come to us and said, well, what do we do now? Like, do we send him a notice to comply? And I'm thinking, well, I don't think someone of that nature would actually respond to a notice to comply. And I'm not sure really, man, and I wanted to ask you today about this, whether or not if someone's damaging property that they don't own, I mean, is that a criminal matter? Or, I mean, we could obviously go down the NCAT path, but what do you do? And he's actually he's proxy farming. He's bad-mouthing the Strata committee. He's actually calling the manager, one of my, colleagues, calling her a puppet of the Strata committee. And, obviously we're just doing our job. And, he's obviously doing the wrong thing. I mean, apart from the fact that he's using water that doesn't belong to him, you can see this whole piping. I mean, it just looks shocking.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. A few things there. Your question about, is it a criminal matter? The short answer is no, because where an owner is interfering with the common property, they essentially have a legal interest in the common property, right? By nature of being an owner. And that's how our strata law works. Yeah. Everyone's a member of the owners corporation. Everybody has a legal interest in the common property. But there are rules to follow when it comes to interfering with, adding to, altering that common property, and those rules are in our legislation. So if a building was to go to the police and say this person has damaged our property, the police are going to say, sorry, no, not a matter for me, because technically this is that person's property as well. And police often say things like, oh, it's a civil matter. So it's a matter that, yes, there is a legal regime here, but it's not the criminal law. It is the strata law. And that's the avenue that the owners corporation should be going down. And look, when I've been asked to advise in difficult cases where we have maybe difficult characters, people who have a mental illness, for example, people who are criminals themselves, who are known to police, who are drug dealing. We've had bikies in the past. We've had gangs. We've had some serious damage to common property, ripping out cameras, smashing glass in lifts and things like that. You might have experienced some of this
too. Yes, I remember that one. Yeah, I remember that one.
My advice has always been, don't assume that these people will just ignore notices that are sent out by the owners corporation. Yes, they might, but it is really important to follow what I call the usual enforcement procedures. And the reason that's important is because you never know when this person's going to sell, for example, or if they're a tenant, getting the attention of the landlord through bylaw breach notices to comply, ultimately tribunal proceedings is going to be really, really important, because the landlord really doesn't want to deal with all of that crap. They're looking at their bottom line, get that tenant out, get somebody who's better behaved in. You don't know whether there's a family member who might be assisting someone who may be suffering from a mental illness that's impacting their behavior. That family member might see these notices and go, hang on, mate, we've got to sort this out. What's going on here? So there's a lot of benefit to following those usual enforcement procedures, even if you assume that this person is just going to get that notice and rip it up. They may well do that. Then for your situation in particular with this piping, is it the case that the owner's corporation could just have a contractor come in and remove all of that from outside the lot? You don't need access to the lot and able to just rip it all out?
To an extent, that's correct, Amanda. They could remove it from their facade, and then the part that goes onto the balcony, they'd have to probably, I suppose that's another thing they could do is cut that part off so that,
because that's open to the owner's corporation. That is part of its repair and maintenance duty to remove illegally installed structures. What usually holds owners corporations back from that is that they can't physically do it. They can't get access to the lot. They can't restore it. But something that is installed external to the lot or part of it, to just come in one day and rip those things out, I mean, he's probably going to jump up and down about that.
Well, I think he'll reinstate. I think what he'll do is reinstate it. I think I've come across lots of people that do things like that, but to actually get a power saw and that's next level, I think. Because it's not just like getting, bolts and trying to cut something. You actually, and so I think perhaps the owners corporation should remove the piping, and then if he reinstates it, then start the next set of, which is not to issue a notice to comply, but to go to mediation and get an order. I think that it's anyway that's going to. Yeah. Yeah.
And the weird thing is you might find, I've had some buildings hit this roadblock previously where they look through their bylaws and they say, actually, I can't point to a bylaw that says, thou shalt not damage the common property. It's kind of not there. I think something to that effect was in an older version of model bylaws. It's not in the model bylaws anymore. So I have had that question before. Amanda, what if an owner or a tenant just goes and damages the common property? They're not necessarily doing work. They're not adding to. They've just, for whatever reason, smashed something, run into something, ripped something out. What do we do? And your fallback there is the Act. They have breached the Act because they have technically altered the common property without approval. And Section 111 of our Strata Schemes Management Act in New South Wales says that if you are going to interfere with the common property, you need some form of approval, whether that's under the bylaws, whether that's minor works approval under the Act, whether it's cosmetic work under Section 109. You have to be able to point to some approval that you've got. This guy obviously doesn't have approval to do what he did, certainly with the piping and with the tap. So you're right. It would be mediation and then seeking an order that whatever common property has been damaged be reinstated.
Yeah, and maybe perhaps if the committee did go down that path, which they should, then maybe he might pull his head in. And sometimes some people need that next step before they. But I must say, it's like sort of being in the wild, wild west in the cowboy days, where you just it's really interesting how you see people's behaviour. And anyway, it's like, you're saying no to me, so I'll fix that. It's really that type of mentality. Yeah, interesting.
And, that's the nature of strata and strata management. One day you're working with lawyers negotiating a $5 million construction contract and everyone's being very commercial and very sensible and looking to improve the building. And then later on in the week, you're dealing with residents yelling and screaming and smashing up pipes. I mean, what other profession?
Yeah.
So one extreme to
and then also, man, I think, and this is another challenge I'll talk about in the future, is that plus your normal day-to-day duties. So this is the thing I think that people don't understand about Strata is that, like, one of my colleagues now has got a different role in Strata, and I think he knows who I am. So he says to me that now he can plan his day, whereas in Strata management, you really can't plan your day because these things happen out of the blue, and then you've got to drop everything else that you're doing, and then because people are, upset and emotional about things, so you've got to direct your attention. Yeah.
For sure. All right. Well, keen to know how that one turns out. Rena, keep a flag on that and come back to us. My challenge for this week comes from our members Q&A forum. I was scrolling through the forum earlier today and I saw a great question there that I thought I'd bring to the podcast. The question was this, Amanda, what is a good balance for a capital works fund? Is $25,000 in the fund good enough? Is $50,000? Does it need to be $100,000? And this question is coming from someone who I think I can tell from some other posts appears to be an agent, maybe a property manager. We do have lots of agents, property managers inside the membership, being able to tap into that Strata knowledge and get their questions answered for their clients. Maybe advising someone on the purchase of a property and looking at those financials and looking at the bottom line figure there, what's in the capital works fund, what's a healthy balance, what should it be, are there any benchmarks around this? And my answer, as you might be able to guess, Rena, was I can't say. Without any other knowledge of what's going on in that building, first of all, how big it is, what projects they might have on, whether they have just replaced the lift or the roof membrane, or whether the roof indeed is leaking and needs to be replaced, whether they have a strata manager, a building manager, what facilities they might have that may need repair and maintenance. Every building is different. And no, we don't have any benchmarks for what might be normal or necessary or healthy for our capital works funds. I'm not saying that's impossible. With the right data, I think that certainly could be put together, and I'm hopeful that that's a direction that maybe our New South Wales Strata Hub is heading in, having to report capital works fund balances each year. But the other thing that I pointed out to this member, and a reason why I wanted to discuss this today in case others aren't aware, the 10-year capital works fund plan is a really good place to start if you are asking this question of a particular building or about a particular building. What does that 10-year plan say should be in the fund at this particular point in time? Now, I said in my response to this member, while I suggest have a look at the 10-year plan, I acknowledge that's not always going to be perfect, because some buildings, A, don't comply with their plan or do things in a different order. So we were going to do the lift in 2030, but all of a sudden the lift has conked out. We need to do the lift now. We've been raising money for that since 2024. We've then paid for that lift to be replaced, and that's the reason why we don't necessarily have the money that the Capital Works Fund plan says we should have had at this point in time. So really hard. And I think if you're asking this question, you've got to look really closely at a number of other things to be able to get the right answer as to whether that balance is healthy. Any thoughts on that, Rena?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always mention when we get to that motion on the AGM agenda, which is a statutory motion considering the capital fund forecast, that this is only a guideline, number one. I mean, for someone to give you an accurate report, and if you think about it, they would have to understand and examine and investigate the state of all your capital assets. So they would have to go and look at the lift, go through, which is what we did. Say someone's doing a lift audit report. They go through all the past records of the maintenance contractor and see how many breakdowns. They look at the original installation date. They look at the parts. So for someone to give you a really good analysis in terms of when that lift should be replaced, that's the sort of money you'd be spending. And some buildings, not many, will have like an asset register where someone will come in, look at every single piece of plant and equipment, capture it, and then work out, where it is in the life cycle. But also what's happened, and I think this has really thrown all our capital fund forecasts out that have been done, say, prior to 2021-22, would be the Design and Building Practitioners Act, because all our forecasts that we've had for, say, buildings that have had to do waterproofing, and not taking into account this legislation, which wasn't known at the time, and its impact. I mean, even if the legislation was known, and I'm sure people would have known about drafts and whatever, but no one would have understood the impact in terms of the regime of people getting certified and getting their certificates and the liability that's attached to the person now, which wasn't the case earlier, the fact that you've got to put on the portal, so that has increased the cost significantly. And it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, people have spent a lot of money in the past, and so I say good money after bad, because they've spent the money, but not in 5 years later, the same water leaks are emerging. Because these are these Band-Aid jobs and no responsibility taken, which is obviously why the government changed legislation, and it obviously is applying to new buildings and older ones as well. So if a balcony now is costing, $200,000 to fix and you've got 50 of them, well, your capital fund forecast is not going to reflect that. I just say it's a guideline, use it as a guideline. But I mean, sometimes when my buildings have no money, or someone comes along and, they want to run the capital fund down, and I say, well, okay, there's 50,000 or 100,000 in the capital fund and there's 30 of you. Well, I mean, that means like you've got 3,000 in the bank. Like in real life, would you be able just to have $3,000 in the bank if something happened in your life? I mean, even if you don't have a lot of funds, people may have access to cash. They can sell shares, they can liquidate things to pay, or they can borrow on their, equity on their home loan, or whatever people can do. So it's about having access to capital. And so I suppose, does the building have enough money in the bank per person? I try and use that. That analogy is easier for me to try and get people to think about when they are running their capital funds and or they don't want to raise enough money. And so, okay, you've all got $2,000 each in the bank. So, if the hot water system breaks down, we know we've had problems, then that, we'll need a special levy. And, then we can't have that. So sometimes it's about trying to appeal to the singular rather than the collective to try and get the message across.
Yeah, I like it. Good strategy. Very interesting. It's always good to hear from you, Rena, how this is playing out on the ground. And yeah, great point about the Design and Building Practitioners Act and how that has skewed our capital works planning. And look, I think most buildings will be sitting on capital works plans that don't take that additional cost into account. As you said, there is a statutory motion, so it is mandatory under the legislation to have this motion included on the agenda of every AGM that we review our capital works plans. And it's open to an owners corporation to say, oh, well, the plan's only 3 years old, 4 years old, we're not going to renew it. Managers, just remember this discussion and that maybe encouraging your buildings for these reasons to review their plans is a good idea, making sure that they're aware of these changes to the legislation. Maybe there's some more around the corner with NCC 2025 coming up. All of that has flow-on effects for the cost of capital work in our plans.
Yeah, definitely, Amanda.
Okay, moving on to your win for this week, Rena.
Yeah, so we had a case, Amanda, in one of our schemes where a lot owner wanted to lodge an insurance claim. They suffered water ingress through a window, and basically the Strata committee said, no, it's your fault. You left the window open. We're not going to lodge the claim. It's going to impact our renewal and our excess, etc. And then the person ended up going to NCAT, and luckily enough, through both lawyers on each side, the matter has now settled, and the Owners Corporation has agreed to submit the insurance claim after all that.
Interesting. So we've talked about this issue a little in the past, Rena, about whether owners corporations have to lodge insurance claims. And I think we both agreed that no, they don't. It's open to them if they say, look, the excess is too high, or we don't think this is an insurable event. They're not going to lodge the claim. But there is that section in the Strata Schemes Management Act which permits a lot owner to go to the tribunal and seek an order forcing the owners corporation to lodge the claim. So it sounds like that's what this lot owner did in that case. And I'm not sure how far things got in the tribunal, but the owners corporation decided perhaps no skin off their nose, lodge the claim.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes some people take a very intransigent sort of point of view based on principle, because the person spoke to me at the time, I remember the committee member said, oh, it's just a matter of the principle. But, as we know, principle comes at a cost. So sometimes it's better to, like, as you said, Amanda, without any proof that the person did it on purpose or whatever it was, in terms of the fact that that owner may have had some contributory actions that led to the water ingress as alleged. But, I mean, at the end of the day, unless you can prove that and it was done willfully, and I doubt it was. But, yeah, unfortunately, sometimes people need to be brought to the door of the tribunal before they actually will realise that perhaps taking such a principled position is not really in the best interest of the owners corporation in the long run.
Yes, it is unfortunate for everyone except the Strata lawyers.
That's right. One man's meat's another man's poison, Amanda.
But whenever we discuss this topic, I do hear from listeners who say, Amanda and Rena, don't forget that lot owners can lodge claims as well. And yeah, I've seen that happen. I don't know your experience has been, whether insurers accept those claim forms filled in by lot owners. Good one to remember.
Yeah, I had one years ago, man, in a community association where someone was doing voluntary work and they fell over and they wanted to lodge this $40,000 voluntary workers claim or something. I can't remember what it was. It was a huge amount. And we said, no, no one asked you to do it. You did it without our consent. No one asked you to do any gardening, whatever. And then he just went behind the community association's back and just lodged it. And was successful. So,
wow. Yeah, there you go. So worth a try if you don't want to go battling with your owners corporation, forcing them to lodge a claim. You need to have access to the policy details and know who you need to lodge the claim with. If you can get that information, then worth a try.
Well, that information is usually readily available either on usually like a portal for a strata company or with your AGM agenda usually you get a copy of the policy and the number
Policy
and everything.
details. Yeah. Good point. Awesome. Well, congrats to those parties for resolving that dispute. My win for this week, I am very pleased to be able to share that after, I think it's now about 12 years of dealing with a leaking apartment, one of my clients is about to move back in to their newly fixed up, properly repaired home. This is a case that actually ended up in the Sydney Morning Herald about a year or so ago. And because this is public information, I know this person doesn't mind me saying, his name is Philip. And the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald article at the time was, Philip's been waiting 10 years for Strata to fix a leak in his apartment. And Philip is one of my clients. And yes, that was a fact. Philip came to me in 2020. And so at that time, it was about 7 or 8 years that his apartment had been leaking. Reasonably large building, unfortunately, a very troubled building, particularly when it came to building defects. I mean, it was a building that just wasn't constructed properly from the start. And unfortunately, the owners, the committees over the years were left with the very difficult task of fixing all of these problems. Ultimately, with my assistance, Philip ended up in NCAT. And once the Owners Corporation's insurer, there you go again, Owners Corporation's insurer got involved, that case was properly settled. And Philip's apartment, of course, by then was uninhabitable, and he has been living in temporary accommodation for close to 2 years now. Spent many years living in his leaky apartment and then ultimately moving out and receiving that temporary accommodation amount weekly paid by the insurer ongoing until he is moving back in. But we are waiting for the sign-off, soon to hear that everything has been completed and he is finally able to get back into his apartment. I mean, just think about that chunk out of a person's life.
So, Amanda, can I ask you, you said this building has troubled past because of its badly constructed history, but are you saying that the Owners Corporation didn't want to fix his apartment as part of a defects case, or is it that this was an extension of just something else that went wrong in that building in addition to the defects that it's had in the past?
I think it's one of these examples of there was so much going on around the building. By the time I got involved, no one was suing the original builder or developer anymore.
Yeah.
All those time periods had expired. But there was work that was being done on the roof. They were on about their second or third contractor. That in that respect, insurance had been involved there because the work hadn't been done properly the first time around. Philip's complaints really had been deprioritized, I'm going to say. And for whatever reason, you know, we know, Rena, dealing with these situations often, there's often personalities involved. There are claims that aren't taken seriously. There are claims that perhaps when a committee knows this is all going to be a headache, it's going to be expensive, let's just make him wait. And, you know, it doesn't take long if somebody's patient enough for 10 years to pass. And sometimes people who are suffering don't realize that there is another way, that they are entitled to, if their apartment is uninhabitable, to be moving out to somewhere dry and healthy and safe, and to have those costs met by the Owners Corporation or by its insurer, if its insurer will respond to that event, until they go and seek some advice. And not everyone can afford that advice. No. You know, you heard me say I first got involved in 2020. It's 2025. I've been Philip's lawyer for the last 5 years. You know, you can only imagine the expense that has been. And he's been lucky that he's in a position to afford that. Not everybody is. So, yeah, a whole host of reasons, I think, Rena, and I want to acknowledge that I'm not in the minds of the committee or the building, but the good news is that for everybody involved, lawyers, the insurer, the committee, and indeed Philip, it is all finally coming to a happy conclusion.
And I can ask you also, you said that the insurer was involved in the, I assume, the damages aspect of the claim. So they came to the party because of the fact that the apartment was uninhabitable, or like, because sometimes with these claims, and I obviously don't know the details of this particular one, but sometimes the insurer will come in for damages when something has happened, but sometimes they don't. Like I've got one at the moment where there's concrete cancer between two floors, and I'll talk about this in another podcast, but the insurer is considering whether or not it is going to respond to the loss of rent aspect, as in that the person's had to move out because the bathroom can't be used and therefore it's only one bathroom that the person has. But so in this case, you're saying that the damages claim aspect was responded to by the insurer of the building.
It was. And again, that is not something that I have insight into what policy that was, what the term was, why the insurer covered that. I always say to my clients, take the gift and don't ask questions. When insurers do get involved, these cases are often resolved more quickly and on more commercial terms. Owners' corporations don't have a say. The insurer's lawyer is instructed by the insurer, so they are doing what they see to be commercially sensible. But my experience has been the same as yours, Rena, that, sometimes when the problem is lack of repair and maintenance, then an insurer is going to say, sorry, whatever your losses have been, if it's owners claiming damages, we might pay for your legal fees under a legal defense policy if you're being sued in NCAT, but we're not going to pay the ultimate award of damages or pay for the work to be done. Because
the work, no. But usually, it's very, I should look more into that, how this damages aspect works for each policy. Yeah.
And some policies will have, as I understand it, lost rent protection for investor owners. That's a little bit different to temporary accommodation expenses for owner occupiers. Some policies might offer that as well. But, all the more reason to be thinking carefully about your policy and what it covers. Talking to your broker, asking these questions. No doubt I will receive emails, comments under the episode, if you like, from brokers, from insurers answering some of these questions for us. But different policies will provide different protections.
Yeah, I mean, the loss of rent just means that whether you're an owner occupier or you're an investor, then the equivalent amount that you would have to fork out if you were living there or renting it out would be the same, and that's usually covered. But it's just interesting, Amanda, what you're talking about in terms of defects, not then the insurer coming in with temporary accommodation as under the damages aspect, I think, of the policy. Yeah.
All right, that's all I got for you this week, Rena Van Alst.
Thank you, Amanda.
Enjoy the rest of your week in Strata, and I will look forward to catching up with you next time.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Your Strata Property, the podcast which consistently delivers to property owners reliable and accurate information about their strata property. You can access all the information below this episode via the show notes at yourstrataproperty.com.au.